Okay, so today we're going to talk about editing components, so individual parts of a object, not just the object as a whole. But before we dive into that, I want to just get you in the habit of creating new projects and proper file management. I know we went over this last week, but we're just going to do it real quick here. So I'm going to go File, Project Window, and click New for a new project, and I'm going to call this Week 2 Components. And I'm going to save it in my folder right here. That will work. Click Select and Accept. My project created. I'm also going to save the scene. So I'm going to go to File, Save As, or Save Scene As. By default, because I just created and set that project, it says week 2 underscore components and scenes, and so it's automatically going to the scene folder, which is the correct folder. And I will call this components demo, because that's what this is for. And I will click save. And now I can see up in this top bar that it's saving in my week 2 components project in the scene folder, and the file is called components demo. So now let's get to components. What I have right now in my scene is just a cube, and it is a default cube. I made it just by going to the Polygonal Modeling shelf and clicking on the cube, and it just automatically makes a 1 by 1 by 1 cube. The way that polygonal modeling works is objects are made up of faces, edges, and vertices. So if you right click on the object, hold the right mouse button down, and we're going to go to vertex. And when you do that, a couple things happen. One, the object outlines turn blue. Right, those are the edges. But you also see these little purple, magenta dots in the corners of the cube. Those are the vertices. Right, a single one is called a vertex. I will often say vertice just because I have poor grammar. But vertex or vertice, they're little points that make up individual faces on the object. So a cube is made up of 8 vertices, evenly spaced. Right? We've all taken geometry before. So those are the vertices. The vertices are connected by edges. Right? And then connecting the edges is a face. And every 3D polygonal object is made up of these 3 components. Right? So this is each of these modes: vertex, edge, and face. These are the component editing modes. There's also, if you go to multi, right, hold the right mouse button down and go to multi, you can actually select all of them in one mode. I usually won't do that. I'll usually just stick to one or the other just to avoid accidentally selecting something I didn't want to. But if you want to work that way, you're welcome to. So a couple of notes about these components, and particularly faces. We're going to work almost exclusively with 4-sided faces. Right? They're also referred to as quads, polygons in general, but 4-sided faces. And the reason for that is when you have 4 sides, edges kind of flow better. Objects are easier to modify and manipulate, as you'll see going forward. There are other alternatives to 4-sided faces. So there are, like if I add a cylinder, you can see on the top and the bottom of the faces we have triangles. Right? Those will often show up in cylinder and spherical primitives. Sometimes they're okay, but I try to minimize their influence over the overall object. There is another thing, another form of polygon, and those are called n-gons. Okay, so if I just delete a few of these edges, what I have here is a single face, but that face has 6 sides, 6 edges. All right, so this is a 6-sided polygon or n-gon. We definitely want to stay away from this. All right, 4 is ideal. 3 is okay sometimes. 5 and above are very problematic, oftentimes, because, well, for a few reasons. One, when you start adding additional edges to objects, n-gons can really confuse Maya as far as where those edges are supposed to go. Also, when you start smoothing objects out, you can get some really weird behaviors. So keep an eye out for these. Try to avoid them. I'm sure you will run into them, and we can talk about ways to correct that when they do come up. But that's just kind of a general thing to keep in mind with these. So I'm going to go, I'll just delete this cylinder because we don't need it anymore. I'm going to go back into vertex mode. And we have these individual components, and we can do the same transformations to these components that we can do to the objects as a whole. So we can move, rotate, and scale all of these. So if I select one vertex, I can move it around in any way that I want. So I can just click in the middle, click and drag, and move it anywhere. I can use the handles to constrain it to one axis, and I can use the squares to constrain it, excuse me, to one plane. Okay, so you can move it around wherever you want. You can, well, you can't really rotate a vertex because it's just a single point. But you also really can't scale it because, again, it's just a single point. So for individual vertex, you can really only move it when we're talking about the main 3 transformation tools. But if we go to an edge, we can move, again. We can rotate. And we can scale. And same thing with faces. Okay. Move, rotate, and scale. Oops, there we go. Now you can also select multiple components at a time. Again, this is very similar to if you were selecting multiple objects. Notice if we select 2 vertices, and then if we scale them in towards each other, it's the exact same thing as selecting the edge in between them and scaling that in. All right, same functionality, 2 different ways to do it. There's not one way that's right or wrong. They both get the job done. All right, so you can select an entire face and scale it in, or you could select the 4 vertices. I'm holding down Shift to select multiple. All right. If you left click and drag, you can select multiple. Now, one thing to be careful of when you're selecting multiple objects or multiple components is that you are only selecting what you intend to. So if let's say I want to select these 4 vertices on this face. If I just click and drag across, I select all 4 of those, but I've also selected this one in the back. All right, so if I hit 4 on the number pad and go to wireframe, you can see that I've selected an extra one. Be careful with that sort of selection. You know, as you get familiar with this, instead of trying to select all 4 of those vertices this way, you'll just naturally rotate around the object and then select it that way. Again, just something to keep in mind, particularly with, like, if I want to select these 2 faces, it's easier to shift click than it is to drag across. But conversely, if you want to select all 4 vertical faces, you can click and drag across, and it's a really fast way to do that. All right. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I want to have it recorded as well. Faces have a property about them called normals, and normals refer to the direction that the face is facing, or the front side of the face. By default, on any primitives, the normals will be pointing out. But there are various combination of actions that you can take that will cause the normals to be flipped or reversed. If that happens, it will look like this. You'll just have one face that is completely black, and it will be confusing as to why. And it just means that the face is pointing the wrong way. So if I'm going to delete this front face, which, by the way, you can delete faces, but I'll talk about that in a second. Now if we look on the inside of this cube, you can see the inside faces are all black except for the one that we reversed, and that one is gray. If you do run into this issue, the way to solve it is to select that face, then you go to the Mesh Display menu in the Modeling menu set. Okay, we're in the Modeling menu set over here. Mesh Display, and you've got this Normals section. I'm just going to hit Reverse, and that fixes it. So you can do that. Now, in the process of demonstrating that, I also showed you another thing, and that's that you can delete faces. You can also delete other components, but let's start with faces. To delete a face, it's pretty intuitive. You select the face, and you press Delete. Okay, I'm gonna, oops, that's not what I wanted. I'm gonna add a sphere here for a second, and we'll move this over. So you can delete faces. You can also delete edges. Okay. Now you can't really delete the individual vertices outright, not while they're still attached to other components. If there's only one vertex left, then you can delete it, but at that point you can just delete the object. So you can delete individual components. Now if you need to add that back in, there's a couple of different ways that you can we can do that. I'll cover that in a little bit. So primitives aside, let's learn. So there's two main tools that I want to cover today, and that's Extrude and edge loops, or adding edge loops. So let's start with edge loops. I'm just going to undo back to a default sphere here, and I can delete my starting cube. So edge loops are rings of edges that tend to run around or across the surface of an object. The sphere is probably the easiest way to demonstrate that. If I just go to edge mode, and I'm going to double click on one of the horizontal lines, and when you double click, it automatically selects whatever edge loop that you're clicking on. So if I go to wireframe, you can see that this is an edge loop that runs all the way around the sphere. All right? That's an edge loop. Edge loops are important because they define, I mean, they're large chunks of edges that define the shape of the mesh. The more edge loops that you have, the more detail that you can define in your object. The fewer edge loops that you have, the less detail that you can define, but it also means you can have a smoother overall surface. So also that, to go hand in hand with edge loops, there's also face loops, which face loops, if you select one face, hold down Shift, and double click a face next to it, it'll select that face loop. All right? It's the same as an edge loop, except it's two rings of edges with the connecting faces in the middle. Edge loops and face loops, you can add more if you would like. To do that, if you go to edge mode and then shift right click. So this brings up an edge tool menu. So shift right click is always a context sensitive menu. So if I'm in edge mode, take a look at these options. We have merge, collapse edges, extrude edges, crease. We have offset edge loop tool, insert edge loop tool, a whole bunch of things. If I go to face mode, select a face and shift right click, I've got a whole bunch of different options. I have smooth faces, extrude face, poke face, bridge, detach, triangulate. And then same thing if I go to vertex, shift right click. I have average vertices, extrude vertex. You can see there's some similarities, like there's a version of extrude in every component, but you've got average vertices and circular eyes, all sorts of different things, and I encourage you to just go through the menus, play around with them, kind of get a sense for what each one does. I'm not going to cover every single tool that Maya has, because that would take all semester. I'll hit the highlights, and the rest, I again encourage you to play around with. The Maya documentation is very exhaustive on that subject. So in edge mode, back to edge mode, shift right click, and we have insert Edgeloop tool. So I'm going to click on the options box next to that to bring up my tool settings, because you've got a few different rather important options available to you here. We have maintain position, relative distance from edge, equal distance from edge, and multiple edge loops. And these are the settings that I usually adjust. So the multiple edge loops is rather straightforward, but let's start with relative distance from edge and equal distance from edge. And in order for this to be obvious, I need to make one little change to my mesh here. Let's go. I'll just move that over. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my insert Edgeloop tool, which, by the way, the most recently used tool will always pop up here on the left side at the bottom of the toolbox. Okay, if I hover over it, you can see it says insert Edgeloop tool on the bottom right of the screen. But so by default, the insert Edgeloop tool is equal distance from edge. So with that selected, if I click on one of these vertical edges, I get this green dashed line or dotted line, and that's showing me a preview of where that edge loop is going to go. And as soon as I release the mouse button, it adds that edge loop. Okay, I can hit Z to undo that. So I click on one of the vertical lines, and you see as I move up and down, it's showing me a preview of where that's going to go. And as soon as I release, it adds it. Now, if I go relative distance from edge, I'm going to click right here on this smaller portion of the sphere, this small vertical line. So relative distance from edge, what this is doing is it's taking each of these vertical sections that I'm cutting into, and it's saying, okay, if I want to be halfway between, it's going to go halfway between here, and halfway between here, and halfway between each vertical edge that I'm cutting through. Whereas if I go equal distance from edge, it's going to go an absolute, it's, you know, let's say that that's hypothetically a centimeter, right? It's going to go a centimeter off that edge all the way around. So I can get a uniform border all the way around with equal distance from edge, whereas with relative distance from edge, it will not stay equal. Okay, I can't get this exact placement with equal distance or with relative distance from edge. Okay, you can see how it's really close up here, but it widens out down there. Again, as you kind of play around with this and start to use it, you'll get more familiar with what each one does. If you have one option selected and it's not doing what you want it to do, just try the other one. You'll get better luck with that. The last thing that you can do is this multiple edge loops. So let's say I know I want to add 3 edge loops across. All I have to do is set that to 3 and just left click once, and it'll add 3 evenly spaced edge loops right across wherever I click. If I turn off use equal multiplier, nothing happens. I'm actually not sure what that does. I had a hunch, but I was wrong. Trick that you can do with the insert edge loop tool is if you set your equal your multiple edge loops, if you set that to 1, that will automatically add an edge loop in the center. So instead of having to click and drag and slide and hope you get it in the center, just set that multiple edge loops to 1 and it'll be centered. So that's edge loops. We'll get super familiar with this tool because that's kind of one of the two biggest ways to add detail to your objects. The other way is the Extrude tool. And so I'm going to hit Q to go back to my selection tool, go to object mode. I'm just going to delete that sphere. And I'm going to add a cube. And now we're going to do some extruding. So I'm going to select a face. I'll select the top face here. And shift right click again. And the option straight down here is extrude face. When I let go of that, this little window pops up, this widget changes, and this little window pops up. And so we have a number of different options. 5 options that we can adjust here, and we'll take them one at a time. The first one is the thickness, which is kind of the amount of the extrusion. So it is highlighted by default, and you can either enter a number right next to it, or my preferred way to do it is you just middle click and drag in the viewport, and a couple things happen. One, you can see that it is extruding. The other thing, and this is a mistake that will happen frequently, is I actually accidentally had a second face selected, so it extruded 2 faces, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to undo. When you undo an extrusion, keep an eye on this lower bar where it says undo set attribute. Make sure you undo far enough that it says undo perform poly extrude. Okay? You usually will have to hit undo a couple of times to actually undo the extrusion. If you don't, you're gonna end up with hidden faces, and it's gonna really mess things up. Okay, so I need to make sure I deselect that back face. So now I just have one face selected. Shift right click, extrude the face. Okay, so now I've got thickness selected, middle click and drag, and you can see that I am extruding out additional geometry from the top of the cube. As you click and drag, you can hold down Control for smaller adjustments, and you can hold down Shift for larger, more dramatic adjustments. You'll notice that if I extrude in, I get this weird thing. This is what it looks like when you have 2 faces occupying the exact same space. This is not a good thing. We want to avoid this. If you're trying to extrude in to make a bowl, what you need to do is actually give it a little bit of thickness, a little bit of offset. We're going to cover that here in a minute. But that's the thickness adjustment. Up next, we have local translate Z, which for simple objects will do the same thing. For more complex shapes, it will go in a slightly different direction, but we can leave that at 0 for now. I'm going to set the thickness back to 0 as well. Offset is a really interesting one, and that, whoops, let me select offset. So select it, middle click and drag. Here's what offset does. It kind of scales it in or out. So if you need a little ring there, that's what you can do. And then, so let's say we bring the offset in a bit, and it'll increase the thickness. So now we've got a kind of a pyramid type roof. Okay. And lastly, almost lastly. Fourth, here we have divisions. By default, it's 1 division. But if we increase that, we get additional edge loops. Okay. Don't do 25. Generally, as a rule, this is a whole lot of detail to be adding at once, unless you have a very specific reason for needing this many edge loops at once. Yeah, there are certainly instances where this many edge loops at once is fine, but if you're just trying to add edge loops for the sake of giving yourself some flexibility to add more detail, and you don't really know exactly what that detail is, this is going to be too much, because this is very difficult to work with and keep looking clean and smooth and even. And we want our mesh to stay that way. Okay, so the last one, keep faces together. I'm going to add a cylinder to demonstrate. So I add a cylinder, move it over, and I'm just going to scale it down a little bit. All right, so I've got all those. Now what I want to do is I want to select all the faces around the outside of the cylinder. So I'm going to go to face mode. I'm going to select one face, and I'm going to hold down Shift and double click on the face next to it to select that whole face loop. Okay. And now I'm going to Shift right click and extrude the face. I will give it a little bit of thickness. And then I'm going to go down to this last option, keep faces together, and I'm going to turn it off. And that's what keep faces together will do. Now if I pair that with, maybe I decrease the offset a little bit. That's the Extrude tool. You can extrude faces, you can also extrude edges. What I would caution you against with extruding edges, I wouldn't extrude an edge that is connected to a face on both sides. Because what happens is you get something called non-manifold geometry. Something like this. Because when you start to smooth that out, you're going to get really weird things. And that's bad. So if you want to extrude that edge out, and I'm going to talk about what I just did here in a second. Delete this face first, then you can select that edge and extrude it out. And then it's going to behave a little bit more normally. Okay, so that's extrude. Last thing I want to cover before we make a real thing is what I just did here, and that is the it's a smooth preview. So if you hit 3 on the number pad, if you select a regular cube, hit 3 on the number pad, it's going to suddenly look like a sphere. And that's because what this is doing is smoothing out. It's smoothing out the vertices, but not actually applying it. So if you hit 2 on the number pad, you can see that you have the original geometry is still there, right? It's still a cube. There's still only 6 sides, but it's smoothing it out. So you wouldn't use this for something where you just wanted a cube to look like a sphere, but you would use it if you had, let's say, actually not that. Okay, so let's say we did this, and then I'm going to extrude a top selection of faces. I'll extrude a couple times here. Okay. So you can see that this is very faceted and a little bit rough. If you hit 3 on the number pad, it smooths it out, evens it out. So it's meant to help smooth things out slightly, but not actually change the objects. As you're modeling, don't model in the smoothed preview, because it's not giving you the real representation of where the geometry is. Okay. For instance, if I select this, let's say I select this edge, I just want to make this more of a corner. You can see how the manipulator is already off the surface of the object. As I move that away, and I go back to the regular view, you can see the extreme difference in where it is. So we don't want to model in this view. It's more of a finished kind of view. You do this right before you render or something like that. So those are the main things I want to hit, and then we're going to model a wine glass here coming up next. Another thing to note, let me undo a couple times here, is if you do want your, let me also get rid of that, it's in the way. If you do want to make your cube look like a sphere for real and not just a preview of it, if you go to Mesh and Smooth, it will actually, and you can adjust the divisions. I don't know why it's not updating the preview there. It's more.